Shalom guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about the story of Purim. Purim is an awesome holiday that we as Jews celebrate every single year. It's full of happiness and joy, and we give gifts to one another. So if you'd like to know the story of Purim, just keep listening. Let's get right into it. So it all started with King Ahasuerus, the king of Persia. He was the king from India all the way to Ethiopia, over all the provinces, and he had a wife named Vashti, Queen Vashti. He had summoned her during a banquet, and she decided not to come. He was very offended by it, and he had her banished. So now he was on the look for a new queen. He had all the women from all the provinces, the young virgin women, come and be presented before him. So all these women from all over the place were coming to be presented before him for him to choose a new queen. Meanwhile, in one of the provinces lived a Jewish man named Mordechai. Now Mordechai had an adopted daughter named Hadassah who was orphaned. She was actually his uncle's daughter, so that makes her his cousin. And he had adopted her because she was an orphan, and she was actually going to have to be sent to be presented before the king because she had fit the criteria as a young virgin woman. But before she was sent, Mordechai had warned her to not show her identity, to not let anybody know she was Jewish for fear of her being persecuted. So they changed her name to Esther, a Babylonian name, so that nobody would know or suspect that she was a Jew. So Esther was sent before the king, just as many other women were, and it said that Esther had found favor in the eyes of the king. So that means the king really liked her, and he ended up choosing her as his queen. So the king had a banquet to celebrate. It was a banquet for Esther, and meanwhile Mordechai was actually outside of the banquet, and he overheard two of the king's eunuchs plotting to kill the king. So naturally he went and told Esther, and Esther let the king know on Mordechai's behalf, and it was written in the book of records what Mordechai had done to save the king's life. So the king had a right-hand man. His name was Haman. He's the villain of the story. And since Haman was the king's right-hand man, everyone had to bow before him when they would see him. But Mordechai, as a Jew, is not allowed to bow before anyone, because we as Jews are only allowed to bow before Hashem and no idols and no man. So when Mordechai would be around Haman, he would not bow before him, and that would make him so angry to the point where he hated Mordechai. And instead of attacking Mordechai directly, he decided to come up with a way to decree for all Jews to be annihilated and massacred. So what he did was he came up with his idea. He placed lots to decide on a day, and he went to the king and he convinced the king that this decree should be passed to kill all of the Jews on the 13th day of Adar. So this decree was put out, and it was sent to all the provinces in their languages, and it was put up and everyone was able to see it. And when Mordechai had got the news that on the 13th of Adar all of the Jews were to be massacred, killed, annihilated, he tore his clothes and he mourned, and he was in the streets and he mourned as all Jews were mourning because of this great tragedy. So he went to Queen Esther and he asked her to go to the king, and she reminded him that anyone who was to go to the king without being summoned would surely be put to death. It was a decree. There was no way that you were going to be able to appear before the king and not be put to death if he had not summoned you, unless the king had shown his scepter and he had lifted his gold scepter and decided that you would be able to live. But most people would be put to death if they had just come to the king without being summoned. And when she told Mordechai this, he had told her that if she stayed silent, deliverance for the Jews would come in another way. But perhaps she had been put in this position for this specific reason. Perhaps this is the reason that she had become queen to begin with. So Esther decided that she would do it. She would go before the king. But before she would do that, she asked Mordechai to gather all the Jews and to fast for 3 days, as she would do with her maidservants. So they fasted for 3 days in preparation for this meeting that she would have with the king. And she decided that if she was to die, she would die. So 3 days later, Esther appeared before the king, and it says that when he saw her, he found favor in her. So he lifted his gold scepter, and she touched it, and of course, he was not going to send for her to be killed. So when she appeared before the king, he asked her, "What's wrong? Like, what can I help you with? Why are you here?" And she said that she was there to invite the king and Haman to a banquet that she was preparing at her house that very night. So of course the king sent for Haman, and the two of them went that night to Esther's feast that she had prepared for them. And while the king was there, he asked her again, what is it that you want? Like, even half of my kingdom, I'll give it to you. What is it? What can I help you with? And she said, my king, your majesty, my request is that you come again tomorrow night to another banquet that I've prepared for you and Haman, and then I'll let you know what it is that I really want. And it says that that night, when Haman had left the first banquet that the queen had prepared, that he had seen Mordechai on the way out, and that he was furious. Like, he went home and he complained to his wife and his family about him, and he just couldn't stand Mordechai so much that that very night when he was complaining with his family, they had decided that they were going to build a stake for Mordechai to be impaled on. So they built that stake the very same night, and that night he went to the palace to speak with the king about this stake that he had built, because he was going to ask permission from the king to impale Mordechai on the stake. But it says that that night the king could not sleep, so he had called for the book of records to be read. So as they're reading the book of records, the story of Mordechai saving the king's life with the two eunuchs that were plotting against the king came up, and it was read to the king that night. And he asked the person who was reading the book of records, what have we done to honor Mordechai for saving my life? And he was responded with, we haven't done anything yet. So basically he asked, like, who is in the courts? And they said that Haman was there. So he was like, okay, send Haman in. And so when Haman came in, he said, Haman, like, what would you do for a man who the king wants to please? He was basically asking his opinion on what he should do for Mordechai, but in Haman's eyes, he was hearing, okay, the king wants to do something for me. So he starts giving him all these great ideas. We should get one of the king's horses, we should get your clothing, we should dress him, we should parade him around the city square and just proclaim, this is what the king does for a man that he wants to honor. So Haman, when he said all of this, the king thought it was a great idea. He was like, awesome, you prepare everything and you walk around with the horse and do all of this that you've said with nothing less for Mordechai the Jew. So of course Haman most likely had a freak out moment when he heard this, and he had to do all of this because the king had told him to do it, and who was he to say no to the king? So he prepared everything, and he took Mordechai the Jew, whom he hated, and proclaimed, this is what the king does for someone that he wants to honor. And that night it says that Haman had gone home and he was very embarrassed, and he was like scornful and hateful. And that night he didn't even have much time to be home, because that was the same night that the queen had prepared the second banquet, and he had to go straight over there. So somebody had sent for him, and he went to the banquet. As the king and Haman were at this second banquet that Queen Esther had prepared, and she still had not told the king what exactly she wanted, what was on her heart, and why she had invited the king over to begin with. So he again starts to ask her, what is it that you want from me? Even half of my kingdom I'll give to you. What is it? And that is when Queen Esther mustered up the courage to say, Your Majesty, all I really want is for my life to be spared and the life of my people to be spared, because there's someone out here who is trying to get us, basically, who wants us to be annihilated, who is putting forth this decree for us to all be killed, and all I want is for us to be able to live. When the king heard this, he was confused. He didn't know, of course, that Esther was Jewish, so he didn't know that this whole decree that had been passed was about her and her people. So of course he asked her, who is this evil person that would do such a thing? Who would go after my queen? And she tells him right then and there, Haman is the one who wants to annihilate all of the Jews, and my people, and myself included. So the king in anger left the banquet, the feast that she had prepared, and Haman stayed and begged for his life, because he knew that the king was going to put him to death after what he had done against the Jewish people. So the steak that was actually prepared for Mordechai, that Haman and his family had built for Mordechai, was actually the steak that Haman was killed with. After Haman was put to death for the things that he had done and for plotting to kill all of the Jewish people, Mordechai was actually appointed over all of the belongings of Haman. So he took charge of everything that Haman had owned, and the king had given him the ring that Haman actually would wear too, as the second in charge. Queen Esther had still wanted to talk to the king about this edict that had been put into place of the Jews all being killed on the 13th of Adar, which was still put into place. It had been signed by the king, and the king had told her that it could not be revoked because since it had his name on it, it just couldn't be revoked. So instead, what they did was they put out a new decree, a new edict, that on the 13th of Adar, the Jews were able to band together and actually fight back against anyone who was going to kill them. So that's exactly what they did. They all band together and they fought their enemies, and they overcame anyone who was trying to bring harm to them, and they prevailed. Haman's sons were killed, and the Jews were able to work together and fight for their lives, and they prevailed. And that's the story of Purim, and that's why we celebrate every single year. We celebrate the freedom of Jews, the freedom to protect ourselves. We celebrate just being able to live and be ourselves. And that was the 13th of Adar. And on the 14th of Adar, the next day, all of the Jews celebrated, they rested, they gave gifts, they were happy, they were joyous because they were alive, and they were able to do so because of the bravery that Queen Esther had displayed. So yeah, that's the story of Purim. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I hope you all have an amazing Purim. And if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and comment down below anything else you'd like to see in the future. I'm hoping to do more holiday-inspired videos. Yeah, stay tuned for Pesach. That's the next holiday coming up, Passover. So yeah, thanks for watching. Bye.